Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. In this episode, I'm going to cover 9 websites that make really good resources for reference if you're a Ruby on Rails developer. I use these resources all the time when I'm programming, and I also think they're great if you want to learn Ruby and Ruby on Rails and you're just getting started. So here are the websites. Let's get started. The first website I'm going to talk about is actually 2 websites with very similar or redundant information. So we have rubylang.org, which is the official Ruby website, and we have rubydoc.org, which is actually maintained by an individual, but it has a lot of the same information as rubylang.org, just compiled and presented in a different way. So here on rubylang.org, you could find out what the latest Ruby release is and learn about the changes between releases, and most importantly, it has full and complete documentation on everything that you would want to know about the Ruby language. The most useful part of this website you're probably going to find here, the official API documentation. If we go here, we could look at various versions of Ruby, but this gives you an overview of all of the classes available to you and the methods within them. So let's say you want to learn about the string class and you want to do some manipulations on a string. You could come here to this reference and you could have a list of all of the methods available to you for manipulating that particular string. And as a professional Ruby on Rails developer, I come here all the time to try to figure out what the best way of accomplishing a particular thing might be that I'm trying to do, because there are a lot of methods and functionality available on every class within Ruby, and they're constantly adding new functionality. I can't remember them all, so sometimes coming back here is a good way of scoping out what's available to me, and maybe I'll find a better way of solving that problem. Now this other website here, rubydoc.org, is a very similar website, and I also use this for a reference. Here you could also do a search for string, and it's a little strange in that this is a Google-powered search, and there's different versions of Ruby you could look up, but if you go here to look at the class, you've got all of the same information. Another one that I use a lot is enumerable, and here with the enumerable class, that's how it'll tell you how you're going to iterate over something like an array. So it has like all the find methods, some convenience methods like min, max, select. You could learn a lot about how to do iterations here just by learning what's available on the enumerable class. And then of course, you've got the same information available here on rubylang.org. So both of these websites also link to the second website that I want to talk about, which is the Ruby Programming Guide. Here we go, Programming Ruby. Now if we open up this website, this is a very comprehensive tutorial on everything that you're probably going to want to know about the Ruby language. And when I was starting out using Ruby on Rails and wanted to learn about the Ruby language and the control structures and the basic objects and basically how to structure my program with classes and modules and do very basic things, this website, going through all of these links here, that has told me pretty much everything that I need to know to program in the Ruby language. Okay, the third site that I want to cover are the official Rails guides. And this is a very important resource that you're probably going to go back to time again if you're a Ruby on Rails developer, because this shows you how to navigate the complex concepts that Ruby on Rails is built on. So here you can learn about active record, all of the main features that Ruby on Rails is built upon that you could find here. Here we have the models, we have views, we have the controllers. You could learn how all 3 of those work. And it has guides here, for example, how to send an email using Action Mailer. You could learn all about email here. You could learn about active storage, which is for storing files on your file system using Ruby on Rails. All these little add-ons that Rails gives you, you could learn about here. For me, as a developer who's been doing this for close to 10 years now, I frequently have to come back to this website because over time Rails changes and they do little updates to the API. For example, in Action View with the form helpers, over the last few releases of Ruby on Rails, there have been some changes, like this form width is a new thing that popped up in Rails 5. So I constantly have to come back here to relearn what's changed and get familiar with it. And not only that, but it's a lot of information, and you're not going to remember it all because you're not using it all at the same time. So even if you're a seasoned Rails developer, you're probably going to come back to this site a lot just to refresh your memory on how a particular concept works. You know, even here going back to the active record basics or active record associations I use a lot. For example, I don't always remember the syntax for something like a polymorphic association, and here I could look up the syntax for these particular things and get it right in my program. Also on these official Rails guides, you've got the something called the Edge guides. Here we go, Edge guides. These are kind of incomplete documentations of some of the more advanced features. So for example here, like active record in Postgres, you could learn about special features that are unique to Postgres here, like how to use the JSON storage, how to use an array storage. These are very advanced topics that are nice, interesting features available by Rails, but they don't have the documentation fully written out yet. I guess they're still working on it. These are always a work in progress, by the way. So now the fourth site that I want to talk about is api.rubyonrails.org. And this site is a compilation of the Rails RDoc, which is based on all of the comments, the comment documentation inside of the Rails source code itself. And what this site is very useful for is if you want to look in depth at a particular API feature and you want to know all of the options that you could submit to a function, for example, this is a site to go to. So for example, let's take a look at like the enumerable feature that you could do on a Rails model. Here, active record enum. If we look at this documentation article, we can see all of the syntax that we'll need for properly declaring an enumerable type and inserting it into our Rails model. And this goes into a lot of depth and detail about complex features like this one, a lot more so than the Rails guides do, where I think the Rails guides are intended to be sort of entry level and give you very broad overviews of the Rails features. This is where you'd want to go if you want to look at the options in great detail. So the other day I was trying to figure out some problem with rendering. I wanted to know how to render a custom template and figure out what sort of things I could submit to an Action controller renderer. And I found this right here, render, which kind of tells me all of the things that the render facility takes. And then I was able to find that I could submit, I could submit a file, I could submit pure ERB or HTML and have that rendered. This gave me a good overview of what my options are, and I was able to have a better idea of what tools I could use to engineer a particular solution. And here you could also look up all of the things that active support offers you, which is a whole lot of methods and classes that do very common tasks. For example, like with number helper, you have things for formatting numbers in a more human readable way, number to currency, stuff like that, things for converting floats. Now this website here that I want to cover is a little bit different because it is all about writing tests. BetterSpecs.org teaches you how to write better RSpec tests for your application. If you're writing an application with a team or that's going to be scaled at any level, at some point you're probably going to write a very large comprehensive test suite. And the tips here are sort of a style guide that show you the best way of structuring your RSpec tests. It goes over all the features like subject, how to use let blocks, and how to sort of write your tests in a way that is easily readable and can break down into ways to test different permutations of things that could go wrong. Because Ruby is an interpreted language and there's no compiler, testing is very important. Whenever your team is making updates to an application, tests are very important for catching regressions, whereas in other languages such as TypeScript, you have a compiler to find typos and things like that. Ruby doesn't have such a thing. What's going to happen is you're probably going to run into some type of runtime error. And the more comprehensive you could write your tests, the better off you're going to be and the more robust your application is going to be when it comes to change. So if you read this entire guide, that'll teach you pretty much how to master RSpec and be great at doing test-driven development. And the next thing on my list is the Rubocop style guide. Rubocop is a Ruby gem that is a code linter. What it does is it analyzes the code that you wrote and tells you ways that you probably could have used syntax better or written your code in a more human readable fashion. What's great about the Ruby style guide is that it keeps you kind of up to date with the latest trends on how to style and structure your code. So it'll teach you things like how to use spaces and indentations and lines to be a little bit more consistent and make your code look a lot more professional. If you have a whole team using this system, it'll help your code look a lot more uniform and a lot more consistent throughout the application. And a great thing about this style guide too is that sometimes it finds more efficient ways of writing the same thing. Here's a good example. The shorthand for accessing a particular function in a block. So in this example, you could have names.map, you have the name variable, name.upcase, or you could use this little handy shorthand syntax, which is the ampersand and then upcase the symbol, which does the exact same thing. This shorthand accesses the upcase method on the object being mapped. If you didn't know that, then you could easily learn this sort of thing if you use Rubocop and read the Ruby style guide. So it's a pretty good way of learning some new little tricks that you may not know before, and over time you get better at being a Ruby programmer. Another thing too is that over time the preferred styles sort of change, so sometimes there are new features added to the Ruby language, and Rubocop will let you know about that, and you could adjust your code accordingly. This next site on my list is more of a tool than it is a documentation tutorial, but it's a very useful tool if you're going to be doing anything with strings, in particular regular expressions. So this Rubular website, it has a Ruby instance behind it, and what you could do is you could use it to test out your regular expressions and build them in real time, seeing if they work very well on your test string. So for example, we have an address here. Let's say that we just want to use a regular expression to parse out the city, state, and zip code out of this. We could try writing a regular expression here and seeing if it works in real time. Let's give this a try. So we're going to start off at the beginning of the line with the up caret, and then we have a word character, more than one word character. So here we're capturing everything at the begin, every word at the beginning of a line this way, but we want to have it with this city, comma, state, zip code thing. So parse out the comma, space, exactly 2 alpha characters that are uppercase, another space, and then we're capturing a 5-digit zip code. And here we have our city, state, and zip. We could take this regular expression and use it directly in our Ruby code by copy paste. So here I am in a Ruby program. Let's use the scan function of string s.scan, our regex, and we get an array with our regex captures. I use this Rubular site a lot if I'm doing anything with strings and I need to parse out particular things with them. It's a great practice tool and testing tool. Okay, so this next one is actually an archive of an older piece of documentation that's no longer available. There's a feature in Rails called Arel. I think it stands for Active Record Relations, and it is the tool inside of Active Record that Rails uses behind the scenes to build queries. And sometimes this is very useful if you want to write a really complex query and the standard tools that Rails gives you through the Rails guides, the standard APIs, aren't good enough. What you could do is you could build an Arel query and send that into a where clause inside of your active record query. But here's a documentation, here's a guide for how to use Arel and how to build Arel tables and Arel expressions that you could feed right there into where. This used to be its own project, and here this web archive page is pointing to Rails/Arel, and you could probably find this documentation also if you go to GitHub and look at a past tag and find an older version of the README, but this is a very good guide that gives you an overview on how to use it. I think they removed the documentation because this was a part of the Rails API that was internal and they didn't want to support it externally. So if they're going to deprecate something in Arel could be deprecated without warning, which is, if you're going to use it, a good reason to write extensive tests for this sort of thing. However, the Rails maintainers didn't want to keep writing documentation for this because they wanted to be able to change this or modify it at any time without having complaints from the community, I guess. However, you could still use this feature. It's used a lot in enterprise level systems, and something that is just good to be familiar with if you want to be a Rails developer and get into another interesting feature of Rails behind the scenes. And that leads me on to the final site that I want to talk about, which is GitHub itself, because there's a lot that you could learn just by reading the Rails source code. So here we could download this into our local machine. As you can see here is the Arel part of Rails. If you really wanted to make use of this feature and maximize its utility for your complex queries, you could come here, figure out how it's put together, and build your own queries that way and interface this more directly within your program. Also, sometimes the issues are a very useful resource. Sometimes there's little bugs or things that don't seem to be working right, and then if you come here and look at the GitHub issues, you might find that people are already talking about it, or they might have a workaround for a particular problem that you've encountered. And this doesn't just go for Rails, but it goes for pretty much any Ruby gem out there that you might be working on. I found GitHub, just looking at the source code and looking at the open issues and pull requests, to be an incredibly valuable resource for me as a programmer. So those are the main resources that I use for reference regularly as a Ruby on Rails developer. I think if you get familiar with all of those websites, you'd have a starting point for solving just about any problem in Ruby on Rails. And if there's one that I don't know about or you think I forgot, go ahead and tell me about it in the comments below. Maybe I'll do a follow-up video and I'll mention your favorite site. So if you found this video useful and informative, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to my channel, as I'm working on a lot more great content like this. See you in the next video.